start off by thanking our Snowman Team Ministry for doing a great job making sure everything was cleaned off and safe as we came in this morning. Thanks to them. I don't know if we needed the Goober ride today, if we had enough spaces or not, but if you did get a chance to use the shuttle today, thanks to Kevin, your driver, for that. And the way we're going to work that, if you do happen to use the shuttle one week because you can't find a place to park, we'll run the shuttle right up to the top of the hill. We got permission from Freedom Metals to use their parking for that on Sundays. And they'll drop you off right down here. And then the pickup will be over here at the activity center. That way, if it's snowing, raining, or whatever, you can wait inside till the van comes by, and they'll take you right up, and we'll just run that until everybody's back. So I think we have a good plan in place if we need it. So thank you in advance for those of you who say that you would just preemptively make the decision to help us out by taking a little bit of pressure off of our parking. We do appreciate that. I'm really excited about this new series that we are starting today called The Shadow King. It's a series about the life of David. And David is an Old Testament character. Some of you may be familiar with his life story, but I'm not going to make the assumption that everyone in the room, that everyone watching on our live stream this morning knows the ins and outs or the full story of David's life. I do want you to know that what we're talking about is, it's not just myth, it's not just someone from the ancient past that maybe existed, maybe didn't exist. David was a real person, and his life story is recorded for us in the Bible. It's true, it's accurate, it's reliable, and that's where we're pulling from, that historical record of David's life. David is arguably the most famous ancestor of Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as the son of David, an ancestor of David. David was an incredibly successful king. He was a very strong leader. He was a very skilled warrior. But beyond that, beyond the tough parts of David that we might look at and admire, he was an incredible poet. He was an amazing musician. And so there are a lot of things to admire about David, but he was also a man with flaws. He was a man who had stains on his life record. Some of the most famous stains that we might think of would be adultery and murder, but he also was not a great father. He was not a very good husband. If you're ever to read a book on parenting or a book on marriage, there's most likely not going to be a chapter in any of those books that's going to highlight David as an example in those areas of his life. So here's the difference, though, between how the Bible presents history and how our modern American culture presents history. You probably have noticed in recent years, especially, there's like this violent, almost irrational desire to erase parts of our American history by tearing down statues and renaming schools and renaming military bases. And ostensibly, the reason that's given for why this needs to happen is because these people had flaws. These people had stains on the record of their lives, and therefore we are told we need to get rid of their names off of these buildings and statues or whatever. Well, thankfully, the Bible does not take that approach to history. The Bible has preserved an accurate, reliable, and realistic record of people's lives, and there's things about people that we can admire. There's things about people's lives that we can look at and see that they're mistakes, and they made a mess of things. And I love that about the Bible because it's relatable, because you and I are imperfect people. There are things in our lives that we look back on, and I'm sure that we're not proud of. So I appreciate that the Bible presents an accurate record of people's lives, even the things that maybe aren't as flattering in their life record. I think it also is refreshing when I read God's Word and I see the things that I can admire and the things that maybe I would not want to emulate in someone's life. It's refreshing to me because it reminds me that God uses imperfect people like us. That's really where I'd like to start our sermon this morning when it comes to our topic for today. It's a whole series. We're going to work through this through the month of February. But I want to start with this question. Just try your best to be honest. Now, if you're at home, I guess maybe the people in your living rooms, they are going to know you well enough to know whether or not you're telling the truth or not. So we're holding each other accountable on this, okay? Here's the question. How many of you would be willing to declare publicly, in front of all the people in the room, declare publicly that you believe that you have a stain-free life record? How many of you would say, I have you look at my life record, it's stain-free? Anybody in the room that would like to claim that? Okay, you might think that about yourself, but at least you didn't put your hand up. So we'll give you that if you think that about yourself. And I would say that I would not dare claim that about myself either. If my life were a white dress shirt, like a white button-up dress shirt, if that represented my life, it would not be hard to find some meatball stains on that white dress shirt. I'm sure of that. I am appreciative that God not only has recorded for us a historically accurate record of people's lives. I appreciate the fact that when we read through some of these stories, like David's, it is proof that God uses imperfect people. Here's something else I love about David's life. It demonstrates that God also uses unlikely people. And that's different, right? You've got imperfect people, we're all that. But God also uses people that you wouldn't think that He would use. People that you might look at this person and say, well, this is clearly someone who's talented and they have this going for them, and that's got to be who God wants to use. And you look at another person and you might think the opposite. Well, God would never be able to use this person because they're this or they're not that. And David's life demonstrates that God, in fact, does use unlikely people to do meaningful things in life. Now, this morning, we're going to focus a lot more on the highlights from David's early life, not so much on some of his flaws or some of the stains on his life record. We'll get to that eventually. But we're going to focus a lot on some of the highlights in his early life. And what we're going to see is even in those moments, these high point type moments in his life, things that we would admire about David, what we're going to see is that God does, in fact, use people that you wouldn't expect to do meaningful things in life. I wonder if you've been like me, you've maybe sat in a sermon, or you've heard a sermon, or you've maybe read a book, and you read the life or you hear a story about maybe a missionary, a famous missionary, that left everything behind and went off into the Central African Republic, and people came to know Jesus, and it was hard. They sacrificed a lot to make that happen. Man, that is really meaningful. I wonder if God would ever use me to do something meaningful. Or maybe you hear a sermon, and in that sermon maybe it's about sacrifice, maybe it's about serving God, maybe it's about discipleship, and you hear these stories or you hear these examples of maybe someone who decided to start a Bible study where they work, or maybe a Bible study where they go to school. Man, that's pretty amazing. I wonder if God would ever use someone like me to do something like that. Maybe you hear a story about someone who's served behind the scenes for like 30 years in the local church, just faithfully serving, doing whatever they can do to serve God, and they don't get a lot of recognition. Most people don't even know that they're doing it, and you hear that story, like, man, that's amazing. I wonder if God would ever use me to do something meaningful like that. Or maybe you hear a story about someone who gives generously, and they're able to send a bunch of kids to camp, or they help send some students to Momentum Conference, or they invest generously into like our building project. There's been lots of people who have invested sacrificially and generously to hand off a ministry tool to generations down the road that won't even know who we are at some point. And you're like, I hear those stories. That's amazing. I wonder if God would ever choose to use someone like me to do something meaningful in this life. And we're taking a look at David's story this morning. I think the answer to that question is absolutely yes. But what I'm hoping that we're going to learn this morning together is, what is it that God's looking for? to use someone like you, to use someone like me? What is the criteria that God is looking for to use people to do meaningful things in this life? I mean, we take a look at the story of David and Goliath, and we hear these kind of amazing stories. That's amazing. Would God use me to do something meaningful? God can use you. What's he looking for? I'm going to invite you to go to 1 Samuel chapter 16 with me this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 16. It's in the Old Testament. You might expect that we would jump into David's story as the king, right? We know David was a king, but that's not where his story begins. We don't jump into his story as king of Israel. We're not going to even jump into the story of David and Goliath this morning. That's not the immediate starting point for David's story. It's an amazing story, and even people that have maybe even never read the Bible probably know the story, or at least have a reference of the phrase David versus Goliath. And when they use that phrase, even in our modern culture, what they're referring to is this idea that the little guy takes on the big guy and the little guy wins, right? It's called David versus Goliath, and we even saw that reference recently in the news with the GameStop. GameStop's this company that these small-time investors, normal, everyday investors, they took on the big-time hedge companies, right? And they figured out a way to beat them, and everyone cheered. Yeah, that's amazing. And in the news, it was reported as a David versus Goliath type of story. And I would venture to say that there were people that used that phrase in the news that have no idea that it's an actual Bible story and probably have never read that. But it's a reference that people use. And certainly, the example of David versus Goliath is an inspiring story of a little guy who takes on the big guy and has victory. But in its original context, as a true story recorded for us in the Bible, it's so much more than that. That story is proof that God chooses to do meaningful things in people's life and in people's lives that you would not expect. And for us to be able to really appreciate that story, we've got to go back to the beginning of David's story in 1 Samuel 16. We need to learn what led up to that moment, because David didn't just wake up in the middle of his life. There's some things that led up to that moment. So 1 Samuel 16, what I'd like to do is this. I'd like to walk through the majority of that story with you, tell you the story. There's a specific verse that we're going to take a look at in the middle of that story that's really significant to what we want to talk about today. So here's what's happening in chapter 16. When we first meet David, God had sent his prophet Samuel to go to Bethlehem. You've heard of Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus. It's a small village town. And the significance of Bethlehem are twofold. One, it's David's hometown, and he's famous, and it's where Jesus was born, right? Other than that, there's not a whole lot of exciting things happening in Bethlehem. But that's where Samuel was sent by God to go to Bethlehem to meet this farmer named Jesse. And Jesse had 8 sons. And Jesse's a normal guy. He's a down-to-earth kind of guy. He's not rich. He's not famous. He's just a family man trying to raise his family in the town of Bethlehem as a farmer. And the purpose of Samuel's visit to Bethlehem that day was to covertly anoint the next king. God, the current king Saul, God had rejected him. God had said, I can no longer use you as the king of Israel, and I'm taking the kingdom from you, I'm taking the throne from you, and I'm going to give it to someone else. And we'll look at that a little bit later. But the reason why Samuel was sent to do this covertly was because Saul was erratic and violent. And you can imagine if Saul finds out who is going to be the next king, what he would do. I mean, it's a real high probability that he's going to make sure that guy doesn't have another breath. And so this is a covert operation. Samuel was sent to Bethlehem to anoint the next king. Now, under that, in that part of the story, we might pause and ask ourselves, well, who might it be? Who would you expect God to choose to be the next king? And I know that in modern day America, we've got our government, our political system is very different from ancient Israel, right? It's very different. But our country did come out of, it was born out of England, and they have had empires in the past, and they still have somewhat of a system of kings, queens, princes, and princesses. And so we do have a reference for this in our understanding in today's world. So the first place we would probably look for who would be the next king would be Saul's son Jonathan, the prince. You would expect the king would pass on the throne to the prince. That's typically how we would expect that to go. And the other option would be perhaps like a military general. We've seen that happen throughout history, where you have a coup in the government, things aren't good, and a military general rises up and they become in charge. And we've seen that kind of thing play out in history as well. But God is the one who is choosing the next king. And God doesn't do things the way that we do things. God has a very different criteria that He is using to choose the next king. Probably you and I, if we were to have a list, let's say, okay, God says it's not going to be the prince, it's not going to be a general. All right, would we expect it to be a shepherd from some small town in the middle of nowhere? Is that who we would expect it to be? Some farming family? No, I don't think that we would, and no one else did either. When you read through chapter 16, when Samuel shows up, everyone got nervous. Everyone in the town got nervous. Like, why are you here? Sometimes when prophets would show up in a town, it meant judgment. It meant bad things were about to break loose, and so people were kind of nervous. And what Samuel says is, I'm here to make a sacrifice, and he invites Jesse and his family to be part of this sacrifice. And that's true. All of that happened. He did all those things. But he had another reason for being there. And he pulls Jesse aside and he tells him why he's actually there. And so the two of them then begin to take a look at Jesse's sons. Right? They began to search for God's pick for the next king. And they started probably where you and I would start. They started with the oldest. And I want you to take a look at verse 6. Samuel took one look at Jesse's oldest son, Eliab. And why did Jesse bring him in? Well, he expected Eliab to be the guy too. He's my oldest, he's big, he's strong, he's good looking, he's tall, with all these things. And Samuel looks at him and he immediately thinks this has got to be the guy. He says, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Verse 7 says this. This is the key verse for what we're going to take a look at today. All right, so don't miss it. If you want to underline it in your Bible, highlight it on your tablet. Verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, do not judge by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not see things the way you see them. People judge by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the what? The Lord looks at the heart. The Lord looks at the heart. What was it that mattered to God? What was it that God was interested in? What was it that God was looking for to do something through someone meaningful in this life? It was the heart that mattered to God. And it's fascinating that part of the story is we see all 7 of these young men, David's older brothers, one by one, all rejected by God. I wonder if when the servant, whoever was sent out into the sheep fields, right? That's where David was. He wasn't even invited to the party. He's still out in the sheep fields with the sheep. And someone goes out there to get him almost as like an afterthought. Oh, yeah, I do have one more son, but he's out taking care of the sheep. I wonder if in that moment, David thought to himself, maybe before it even happened, right? I wonder if he's out there and he's taking care of the sheep. He's like, man, he's all fidgety, he's all nervous, and he's like, man, today might be the day. Today might be the day that I get the call to be the next king. I'm pretty confident that was the last thing on David's mind when he's out there hanging out and taking care of the sheep. When someone showed up and said, hey, your dad needs you back at the house. The prophet Samuel's here. Pretty sure you're going to be the next king. I don't think that he was expecting that to happen. And why did it happen? It was God who was looking at the heart. And I want you to see this. We see it in verse 7 here, but I also want you to see chapter 13. Chapter 13, verse 14, when God said to Saul, I'm done with you, I'm moving on from you, I'm taking the throne from you and giving it to someone else. Look at the criteria by which God is interested. Verse 14 of chapter 13, God says to Saul, now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you've not kept the Lord's commands. God already knew before we even meet David. He doesn't show up until a few chapters later in our story. God already knew who he was going to choose. And what was the criteria by which God chose him? It was his heart that God saw and chose David to do some meaningful things in his life. The story continues, and the next scene is Saul is really having a hard time. He's losing it mentally, emotionally. There's this evil spirit that's been tormenting him, and he's making bad decisions. It's a bad scene for Saul. And so the people around him are trying to come up with a solution on how to deal with that. And someone suggests, well, let's find a harp player. Harp music seems to soothe people. And we'll find a harp player, we'll play some harp music, and that'll calm Saul down. And of course, the next logical question would be, fine, let's try that, but where are we going to get a harp player? And I just want you to know, we get that question all the time here at Grace Fellowship. People are always asking that. They're like, yeah, the worship team's amazing. They do a great job. But, we really need more cowbell. And the other thing, could you find a harp player? That's a lie. No one's ever asked for a harp player for our worship team. But they asked for one back then. Where are we going to find a harp player? And I love this, how there's this servant. It doesn't even tell us his name. In verse 18, one of the servants says, I know one. What? You know a harp player? Yeah. One of Jesse's sons, this is verse 18 of chapter 16, one of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, but he's a brave warrior. He's a man of war. Now, that might be pushing a little bit. He might be pumping up David's reputation a little bit. We find out later that he did have a run-in with a bear. He did have a run-in with a lion that he was successful in, but he hasn't had a lot of battles under his belt. Anyway, he describes him as this brave warrior, a man of war. He's got good judgment. He's also fine-looking. And here's the most important part, and the Lord is with him. Now, I would imagine, based on what we see in Saul's life, that last one probably didn't matter a lot to Saul. But that's the one that mattered most to God because it reveals something about his heart. This servant knew something about David, not just that he could play the harp really well, but he knew something about his life. He knew something about his character. Well, where does our character flow out of? It flows out of our hearts. He knew something about David's heart that mattered. Now, I just wondered about that moment too. I wonder if, I can't imagine that David expected someone to show up and say, hey, you're going to be the next king. And I can't imagine that David imagined that this moment was coming along either. I don't think he expected it. I don't think that he expected someone from the royal court to show up one day as he's taking care of the sheep and say, hey, listen, David, I know that you've never competed on Israel's Got Talent. Like you never auditioned for this. You didn't send in your audition tape or anything. But you've been discovered. You're going to be the musician, the royal musician for the king, so get your stuff. We got a dictatorship. Get your stuff. Let's go. And we got to get to the palace. And I just don't imagine that he ever imagined that conversation ever happening. But it did. It was an opportunity that God provided, an opportunity that God opened up for him. Why? Because David had the kind of heart that God can use to do meaningful things in this life. So you take those two scenes from David's life. It provides the backstory for the most famous of stories with David versus Goliath. You got this big showdown between David and Goliath, and it is set in the context of David. At that moment in his life, he is a part-time shepherd for his dad. He is a part-time musician for the king. And on that particular day, he was a part-time delivery boy taking lunch to his brothers. That's the setting in which David shows up on this incredible battle between him and Goliath. So David sets off. His dad gives him lunch to take to his brothers. His three oldest brothers were soldiers in the Israel army. And for 40 days, we see this scene play out in chapter 17. For 40 days, you have this hillside, another hillside, and you got this big valley. And on one side, you got the Israelites and their army and the Philistines and their champion, Goliath. Every day, 40 days, comes out and he's taunting the Israelite army. And he's insulting God every day. And nobody does anything about it. They're scared to death of this guy. And that's the scene in which David shows up with lunch. And he's seeing this happen. He's listening to what's being said by Goliath. He's looking around. I guess he's probably waiting for these guys to charge into the field and take care of this. And nobody does. And there's something that happens in David's heart as he listens to what Goliath says about God's people, as he listens to what Goliath said about God. There's something in him that doesn't sit well. And he's like, who's going to do something about this? And everyone looks at nobody. Well, then I'm going to do something about it. There's something in his heart that says this is not okay. And if you guys won't do something about it, then I'm going to do something about it. Where does that come from? That's something in David's heart. And when that moment comes, his brothers don't think he can fight Goliath and win. Saul doesn't think that he can defeat Goliath. But you know what David thought? We see what David thought in chapter 17, verse 37. Nobody else believes that this battle can be won, but David does. And we see why he thinks that in verse 37. When David comes in front of Saul and he tells him, I'll go fight him, Saul's response is, you're a kid, there's no way. And David says, listen, I've taken on a bear and won with God's help. I've taken on a lion with God's help and won. This Philistine can be the same way. And he says in verse 37, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. What David believed was that God can beat Goliath. And when this moment finally comes, and David steps out into that field with a sling and a stone against a 9-foot giant who is armed and ready for war, it's in that moment that we finally get to see what God saw all along. We finally get to see what God saw. We get to see David's heart. We get to see proof or evidence of a heart that is willing to do what is hard because it's what's right. We get to see evidence of a heart that wants God to be glorified more than he wants affirmation for himself. He doesn't care what his brothers think about him. He doesn't care what Saul thinks about him. He just wants God to be glorified. That's a heart issue. We see a heart that trusts God, no matter what the circumstances look like. I mean, if you and I were to see this play out, got this young kid, no armor, sling and stone against the 9-foot giant, the sword, the spear, all that stuff. You see all of that. No one's going to put $1 on David. Nobody. And yet, David walks into that situation with confidence, with trusting that God can do what seems to be impossible. That's a heart issue. That comes from the heart. That's a heart of faith that we see in David's life. We can see why God chose David to do meaningful things in this life. Because God could see his humble, obedient heart. And that's the kind of person that God can use to do meaningful things in this life. Now, look at the flip side. If you go to chapter 17, verse 28, remember that moment when Samuel and Jesse, the first one they bring out is Eliab, and this has got to be the guy. He's tall, he's good looking, he's strong. This has got to be the next king. And God's like, no, I've rejected him. Well, what did God see in Eliab that he said, no, this is not the guy? We already see what he saw in David. There's a heart issue there. Look at verse 28. When David shows up with lunch, which I think is a nice thing to do. David shows up with lunch that day from his dad for his brothers and sees what's happening, listens to what's going on, starts asking questions like, why is nobody doing anything about this? And verse 28, when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, his response, his emotional reaction was anger. That's his first emotion that he experiences when he sees his brother asking questions. He feels angry, and he confronts him, and he says, what are you doing around here anyway? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? So he's angry, and then he responds to his little brother with condescension. What are you even doing here? There's something wrong with you. He says, I know about your pride. I know about your deceit. You just want to see the battle. Well, that's not true. It's not fair. It's not an accurate statement. It's a condescending statement. And I love verse 29 because it reveals to us a little bit of insight into the family dynamic. This is not the first time that Eliab has said something like this. This is not the first time that Eliab has treated his younger brother this way. Verse 29, what have I done now? I mean, you can just kind of hear this conversation back and forth. What did I do now? Like, I just brought you lunch. I thought that would be a nice gesture. What did I do that was so wrong? What did I do now? And that phrase, I think, gives us a little bit of insight into Eliab's heart. This is a pattern in his life. It's a character issue with Eliab. And we see this scene play out, and I think we can see why God rejected Eliab. Because God doesn't choose to do meaningful things in people's lives just because they're good looking or talented or tall. God's looking for people He can use, and His decision, His criteria, is based on a person's heart, not their appearance. Now, I'm thankful. I know many of you are very thankful that the gospel of salvation is rooted in a person's heart of faith in Jesus Christ. It's not rooted in or found in how many degrees we have up on the wall, or it's not found in how much money we have in our bank account. It's not rooted in how good looking we are. It's rooted in faith, a heart of faith in Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Would you look at that with me in the New Testament? In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul makes this observation about the gospel. He's talking in verse 18 of chapter 1, the message of the cross. That's the gospel. The gospel is that you and I are sinners, that we deserve hell, that we've got this sin problem that we can't take care of on our own. We can't make ourselves right with God. We've got this sin problem. And God's solution to the sin problem that you and I have was to send Jesus, God in the flesh, to die on the cross as a sacrificial payment for our sins so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made right with God. This is the message of the cross. This is the gospel, that our heart of faith in Jesus is what makes us right with God. He's about to explain all of that. The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved, we know it's the very power of God. And the scriptures say, I'll destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent. So where does this leave the philosophers and the scholars and the world's brilliant debaters? So it's not based on how smart you are, that you've somehow figured out how to be made right with God? Well, apparently not. God has made the wisdom of this world look foolish. Since God in His wisdom saw to it that the world would never know Him through human wisdom, He has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It's a heart of faith that makes us right with God through faith in Jesus Christ. It's foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven. It's foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended, and the Gentiles say it's nonsense. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans. God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. He's talking about the truth of the gospel isn't based on what your family name is, how wealthy you are, what you look like, what country you were born in, who you vote for. You can fill in any kind of criteria that you want. That's not what salvation is based on. It's based solely on what Jesus did for us on the cross and a heart of faith to believe in Him and in that sacrifice on our behalf. And then he expands this to make it very, very personal. And he asks them to look at their own lives. And he says in verse 26, remember, talking to believers, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful, or wealthy when God called you. God wasn't interested in those things. That wasn't His criteria for salvation. Instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they're wise. He chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. And as a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. We're not made right with God because we're smarter than other people and we somehow figured it out. We're not made right with God because we're more generous than other people or because we've done less bad things than other people. We're only made right with God through a heart of faith in Jesus Christ and what He did for us that we could not do for ourselves on the cross. And I'm thankful for that. And I know most of you are thankful for that reality. But that gospel truth about the heart of faith is also true when it comes to whether or not God can use someone like you, someone like me, to do meaningful things in this life. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, we oftentimes will look at that verse when we talk about salvation, the gospel, because it reveals to us very clearly that salvation, being made right with God, like we just said, is not based on works, it's not based on anything that you deserve or anything that you could earn. It's a gift of God's grace through faith, a heart of faith in Jesus Christ, right? So verses 8 and 9 are very clear about the position of works in our life. It's not going to accomplish salvation for us. But then verse 10 goes on to tell us that God has, in fact, planned for us these opportunities. He does have good work opportunities for us planned in advance that He expects us as followers of Jesus to accomplish. Meaningful things in this life are planned by God for you and for me. And the difference between those who make the most of those opportunities and those who miss those opportunities, the difference is a person's heart. A humble servant who has a humble heart like David, an obedient heart, is going to make the most of those opportunities. A heart that wants to glorify God is going to make the most of those opportunities. A heart that trusts God, no matter what the circumstances look like around us, and trusts God that He's got a plan, He's going to work out His plan, and I can just trust Him to do hard things because it's the right thing. That kind of heart is the kind of heart that's going to make the most of those opportunities. When we are obedient, when nobody else is willing to be obedient, that's the kind of heart that God can use to do meaningful things in this life. And you might be thinking, well, okay, I see Samuel's example, and that's meaningful. I get it. He's a prophet of God. I see David's example. He took on Goliath. He became a king. That's some meaningful thing in life for sure. I get that God used him for that. But can God use someone like me? I'm probably not going to be a king. I don't think God's going to call me to be a pastor of a big church like Andy Stanley. I don't know that God's ever going to call me to be a famous missionary that's going to go off into the Central African Republic and pave the way for the gospel for millions of Africans. I don't know that God's going to call me to be a chaplain in the military, like we have Mark Penfold that comes in the summer. And those guys, those chaplains, are willing to go into harm's way without a weapon for the sake of the gospel so they can make an impact in soldiers' lives. And they put themselves in harm's way to do it. That's meaningful, but I don't know that God's ever going to call me to do something meaningful like that. Can God use me? Can God use someone like me? I don't know that I'm ever going to be a famous author like Francis Chan or Max Lucado. I mean, those guys, God has obviously used them to do meaningful things, but that's probably not me. could God use someone like me? And here's why you might have that question in your mind. It's because our culture, our modern culture, equates the phrase meaningful things with fame. Our culture says if you're famous, you have the ability to do meaningful things. So like those two things always go together. You haven't really done something meaningful unless it's big, unless you're famous. That's what our culture believes. It's why we've got people who will hear a celebrity make some kind of statement politically, or they'll make some type of statement about how to solve a problem in the world. They're a celebrity, right? Maybe they're an athlete or they're a movie actress or something, and they'll make a statement, and there will be people who will say, "Oh, yeah, that must be true. They're famous. They must know what they're talking about." Most likely, they don't know what they're talking about. They are making a statement out of ignorance, but because they're famous, there are people who just gobble it up. Why? Because people in our culture equate fame with meaning, fame with doing meaningful things in life. And that's just not how God operates. That's not how God sees the world. That's not how God sees you. When it comes to how God sees things, He's got a completely different definition of meaningful things in this life. I look back over my own life. I'm one person. You multiply this out over millions of other believers who could tell stories like this. I'm one person. I look back over my life and I see people that you will never know. Personally, you'll probably never meet them. Some of them are even dead now. Who did meaningful things that impacted my life in a significant way. I look back at some of the Sunday school teachers that I had, and I didn't always make life easy for them, but I can look back and I can remember how they impressed upon my heart the importance of memorizing Scripture. And that still matters to me today because they set that tone. That was meaningful to me. I can look back and see in my mind, some of the camp counselors that you will never meet, I'm sure. You'll never even know who they are. But they made an impact in my life. They did something meaningful. They gave up a week of their life or a summer of their life to invest in students, which I was one. And that was meaningful to me. And it made an impact in my life. I can look back when I was a kid. I can remember Vacation Bible School as a kid. And I always loved snack time. And we would go to the snack time. And there were these ladies, same ladies every year, who were in charge of the snack and the cookies. And when I look back on that, two things. Number one, I'm pretty sure that's where my addiction started to cookies. I can blame those ladies for my cookie addiction today. But that's not your problem. We'll deal with that in therapy later. When I look back to VBS week, what I still, as an adult, remember, those ladies made that special not because of the cookies, not because of the juice that was kind of weird. It was special because they just had this way of making you feel like you mattered. When they talked to you, when they would come around and interact with you, they made you feel special. They made you feel loved. They made you feel like you mattered in the world. And even now as an adult, I can look back and I think every one of those ladies, I think, is home with Jesus now. They're not even around on this planet. And their investment in my life, those weeks, made a difference. It impacted me. It was meaningful. And we could tell lots of stories like that. People who pray for other people, people who are kind and loving, people who, my youth leaders, I look back at my youth leaders when I was a student. My youth leaders gave up a week's vacation. Like, they weren't paid by the church, they were volunteers, and I'm sure they didn't have like 6 weeks vacation. Whatever they had, they gave up one of those weeks vacation to make sure that students like me could get to a Momentum conference, and year after year, God used those conferences to impact my life in a significant way. What those youth leaders did was meaningful. They're not famous. You don't even know who they are. But it was meaningful what they did. And there's tons and tons of stories that we could talk about. And I'm one person. And I bet some of you have stories like that as well. These are the kind of people that God used to do meaningful things and make a big impact in people's lives. They're not famous. They weren't superstars. And they made an impact in people's lives. And I look back on their lives too, and it's not like they were perfect. It was not like they had a stain-free life record either, but that's who God uses. Yeah, imperfect people, but also unlikely people to do meaningful things in this world. So you go back to you. Is God going to choose you to be a king? Probably not. It's unlikely that that would happen. I mean, just there's not a lot of positions like that open. Is God going to call you to be the next warrior against the Goliath? Probably not. That guy's dead, right? So there's certain things that we look in Scripture, and God's not going to call you for those things. But doesn't mean that whatever God is going to call you to do, or whatever opportunities that God places in your life, that they're not somehow just as meaningful. Could God use you to make a difference in someone else's life in a grace group or in a ministry within the local church setting? Absolutely, God could do that. Could God use someone like you and the talents that He's gifted you with, whether it's in music or athletics or art or academics? Could God use someone like you in those gifts to bring glory to Himself? Absolutely, God could. Could God put you in a place of influence where you work, a place of influence in your community, where you are able to stand up for a biblical worldview and impact decisions that are being made? Absolutely, God could do that in you. Could God be calling you to stand up for what is right and to do the right thing, even when it's the hard thing, even when nobody else in the room is willing to do it? Could God use you and give you courage to do something like that? Answer is yes, God could do that in your life. And maybe God is calling you into some full-time ministry. Maybe God is calling you to be a missionary one day. And you say, well, I can't imagine that God would choose me. I'm the most unlikely person. I'm not the person I would ever expect, last person I would ever expect that God would pick for something like that. And I just want to say, you got to remember that He's not looking for the smartest. He's not looking for the prettiest. He's not looking for the strongest. He's not looking for the wealthiest people that He can find. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. You might be all those things. You might be super pretty. You might be wealthy. You might have a lot of influence in the community. You might be super smart. You might be all of those things. And it's not that God is going to exclude you. He's way too good looking for me to use. That's not how God operates either. God doesn't exclude people because they're wealthy and strong and good looking and all those other things. God doesn't exclude people, but that's not the basis by which God is choosing people to be used by Him. God's looking at the heart. I want to read it to you one more time. The Lord does not look at the things that man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God, the Lord, looks at the heart. David was good looking. David was brave. David was talented. David was smart. He had a lot of amazing attributes, and God used him. But those weren't the reasons why God chose him. Those weren't the reasons God chose him. God is interested in your heart. He's looking for a humble, obedient heart of faith. So here's the bottom line. Here's the takeaway. Maybe we could all high-five each other when we leave today and say, yeah, God's interested in our hearts, not our appearance. That's amazing. The takeaway is this. What are you doing to develop a heart that God can use? Just because we could all possibly agree that God's more interested in your heart than He is in your appearance, that God's more interested in your heart than He is your talents, okay, what are you doing to develop a heart, a servant's heart, a humble heart, an obedient heart? What are you doing to develop and surrender your heart to God so that He can use you? Some of you know the answer to that question. You already know the answer. I ask it, you're like, this is what needs to happen to develop a heart that God can use. And some of you not only know the answer, but you're already doing the things that's required. To you, I want to say, keep it up. Don't get lazy. Don't become apathetic. Don't quit. Keep doing the things that are going to develop a humble servant's heart that God can use. Some of you, though, might know the answer to the question, but you're not doing what it takes to have a heart that is developed towards obedience and surrender and humility. And to you, I would just say, repent of that and make the changes. I'm pretty confident that for most of you, if that's how you would answer the questions, I know the answer, but I'm not doing it. You already know what you need to do to change. You already know. You know what steps need to happen today to start taking steps towards a heart that God can use. So do it. If you don't know the answer to that question, then I want to offer you this challenge in two parts. Number one, if you don't know the answer to the question, it's possible that you don't yet have a relationship with God through faith in Jesus. Jesus is the one who changes hearts. Jesus is the one who takes your stone-cold heart and molds it and softens it and puts humility and a desire for obedience into your heart. And so if you need to take that step of faith so that Jesus can start working in your heart, I want to challenge you, click the I'm Ready button. We have it two places. It's on the live stream page. It's on the digital notes, at the bottom of the digital notes if you're using those. We have it a couple places. You can always reach out to one of the pastors, and we'd be happy to make an appointment and sit down and talk with you. But take that next step to learn what does it really mean to have a heart of faith in Jesus Christ as my forgiver, as my Savior, that He can change my heart. Take that step. The other thing I would say is this. Maybe it's possible that you've taken that step of faith, but that's about as far as you've gone with it. That happens sometimes. Someone trusts Christ as their Savior. Maybe they even get baptized, and then they don't do much more with it than that. They don't walk down that road of faith too much farther than that. And if that would be you, and you're like, I don't really know what to do next, I know I should do something, I just don't know what, then I would challenge you to do this. Keep coming every Sunday. Keep watching every Sunday. Get yourself connected to a small group in our church. Here's why. Because every single Sunday, we talk about heart change stuff because we want to be a church that helps people live Jesus-centered lives. We want to be a church that doesn't just get together and sing some nice songs and have a Bible study together and learn some facts about David. We want to be a church that actually helps people know how to live a Jesus-centered life. And we're going to talk about heart change stuff every week, week after week, in every small group and in every sermon. So keep coming, keep listening, keep watching, get involved at that next level in a small group. And that's going to take you farther down the road toward understanding and being able to live out a Jesus-centered life at that heart change level.